Chapter 22. The 4 following days. The night was calm, and in the morning the lieutenant resolved to order the embarkation of everything and everybody that very day. He, therefore, went down to the lake to look at the raft. The fog was still thick, but the sunbeams were beginning to struggle through it. The clouds had been swept away by the hurricane of the preceding day, and it seemed likely to be hot. When Hobson reached the banks of the lake, the fog was still too dense for him to make out anything on its surface, and he was waiting for it to clear away, when he was joined by Mrs. Barnett, Madge, and several others. The fog gradually cleared off, drawing back to the end of the lake, but the raft was nowhere to be seen. Presently a gust of wind completely swept away the fog. The raft was gone. There was no longer a lake. The boundless ocean stretched away before the astonished colonists. Hobson could not check a cry of despair. And when he and his companions turned round and saw the sea on every side, they realized with a shock of horror that their island was now nothing more than an islet. During the night 6/7 of the district once belonging to Cape Bathurst had silently floated away, without producing a shock of any kind, so completely had the ice been worn away by the constant action of the waves. The raft had drifted out into the offing, and those whose last hope it had been could not see a sign of it on the desolate sea. The unfortunate colonists were now overwhelmed with despair, their last hope gone, they were hanging above an awful abyss ready to swallow them up. And some of the soldiers in a fit of madness were about to throw themselves into the sea, when Mrs. Barnett flung herself before them, entreating them to desist. They yielded, some of them weeping like children. The awful situation of the colonists was indeed manifest enough, and we may well pity the lieutenant surrounded by the miserable despairing creatures. 21 persons on an islet of ice which must quickly melt beneath their feet. The wooded hills had disappeared with the mass of the island now engulfed, not a tree was left. There was no wood remaining but the planks of the rough lodging, which would not be nearly enough to build a raft to hold so many. A few days of life were all the colonists could now hope for. June had set in, the mean temperature exceeded 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and the islet must rapidly melt. As a forlorn hope, Hobson thought he would make a reconnaissance of his limited domain, and see if any part of it was thicker than where they were all now encamped. In this excursion he was accompanied by Mrs. Barnett and Madge. "Do you still hope?" inquired the lady of her faithful companion. "I hope ever," replied Madge. Mrs. Barnett did not answer, but walked rapidly along the coast at the lieutenant's side. No alteration had taken place between Cape Bathurst and Cape Eskimo, that is to say, for a distance of 8 miles. It was at Cape Eskimo that the fracture had taken place, and running inland, it followed a curved line as far as the beginning of the lagoon, from which point the shores of the lake, now bathed by the waves of the sea, formed the new coastline. Towards the upper part of the lagoon there was another fracture, running as far as the coast, between Cape Bathurst and what was once Port Barnett, so that the islet was merely an oblong strip, not more than a mile wide anywhere. Of the 140 square miles which once formed the total superficial area of the island, only 20 remained. Hobson most carefully examined the new conformation of the islet, and found that its thickest part was still at the site of the former factory. He decided, therefore, to retain the encampment where it was, and, strange to say, the instinct of the quadrupeds still led them to congregate about it. A great many of the animals had, however, disappeared with the rest of the island, amongst them many of the dogs which had escaped the former catastrophe. Most of the quadrupeds remaining were rodents. And the bear, which seemed terribly puzzled, paced round and round the islet like a caged animal. About 5 o'clock in the evening the 3 explorers returned to the camp. The men and women were gathered together in gloomy silence in the rough shelter still remaining to them, and Mrs. Joliffe was preparing some food. Sabine, who was less overcome than his comrades, was wandering about in the hope of getting some fresh venison, and the astronomer was sitting apart from every one, gazing at the sea in an absent indifferent manner. As if nothing could ever rouse or astonish him again. The lieutenant imparted the results of his excursion to the whole party. He told them that they were safer where they were than they would be on any other spot, and he urged them not to wander about, as there were signs of another approaching fracture halfway between the camp and Cape Eskimo. The superficial area of the islet would soon be yet further reduced, and they could do nothing, absolutely nothing. The day was really quite hot. The ice which had been disinterred for drinkable water melted before it was brought near the fire. Thin pieces of the ice crust of the steep beach fell off into the sea, and it was evident that the general level of the islet was being lowered by the constant wearing away of its base in the tepid waters. No one slept the next night. Who could have closed his eyes with the knowledge that the abyss beneath might open at any moment? Who but the little unconscious child who still smiled in his mother's arms, and was never for one instant out of them? The next morning, June 4th, the sun rose in a cloudless sky. No change had taken place in the conformation of the islet during the night. In the course of this day a terrified blue fox rushed into the shed, and could not be induced to leave it. The martens, ermines, polar hares, muskrats, and beavers literally swarmed upon the site of the former factory. The wolves alone were unrepresented, and had probably all been swallowed up with the rest of the island. The bear no longer wandered from Cape Bathurst, and the furred animals seemed quite unconscious of its presence. Nor did the colonists notice it much, absorbed as they were in the contemplation of the approaching doom, which had broken down all the ordinary distinctions of race. A little before noon a sudden hope, too soon to end in disappointment, revived the drooping spirits of the colonists. Sabine, who had been standing for some time on the highest part of the islet looking at the sea, suddenly cried, "A boat! A boat!" It was as if an electric shock had suddenly ran through the group, for all started up and rushed towards the hunter. The lieutenant looked at him inquiringly, and the man pointed to a white vapor on the horizon. Not a word was spoken, but all watched in breathless silence as the form of a vessel gradually rose against the sky. It was indeed a ship, and most likely a whaler. There was no doubt about it, and at the end of an hour even the keel was visible. Unfortunately this vessel appeared on the east of the islet, that is to say, on the opposite side to that from which the raft had drifted, so that there could be no hope that it was coming to their rescue after meeting with the raft. Which would have suggested the fact of fellow creatures being in danger. The question now was, would those in this vessel perceive the islet? Would they be able to make out signals on it? Alas! In broad daylight, with a bright sun shining, it was not likely they would. Had it been night some of the planks of the remaining shed might have made a fire large enough to be seen at a considerable distance, but the boat would probably have disappeared before the darkness set in. And, although it seemed of little use, signals were made, and guns fired on the islet. The vessel was certainly approaching, and seemed to be a large three-master, evidently a whaler from New Archangel, which was on its way to Bering Strait after having doubled the peninsula of Alaska. It was to the windward of the islet, and tacking to starboard with its lower sails, and top-gallant sails all set. It was steadily advancing to the north. A sailor would have seen at a glance that it was not bearing towards the islet, but it might even yet perceive it, and alter its course. "If it does see us," whispered Hobson in Long's ear, "it is more likely to avoid us than to come nearer." The lieutenant was right, for there is nothing vessels dread more in these latitudes than the approach of icebergs and ice floes. They look upon them as floating rocks, against which there is a danger of striking, especially in the night, and they therefore hasten to change their course when ice is sighted. And this vessel would most likely do the same, if it noticed the islet at all. The alternations of hope and despair through which the anxious watchers passed may be imagined, but cannot be described. Until 2 o'clock in the afternoon they were able to believe that heaven had at last taken pity on them, that help was coming, that their safety was assured. The vessel continued to approach in an oblique direction, and was presently not more than 6 miles from the islet. Signal after signal was tried, gun after gun fired, and some of the planks of the shed were burnt. All in vain, either they were not seen, or the vessel was anxious to avoid the islet. At 2:30 it luffed slightly, and bore away to the northeast. In another hour a white vapor was all that was visible, and that soon disappeared. On this the soldier Kellett burst into a roar of hysterical laughter, and flinging himself on the ground, rolled over and over like a madman. Mrs. Barnett turned and looked Madge full in the face, as if to ask her if she still hoped, and Madge turned away her head. On this same ill-fated day a crackling noise was heard, and the greater part of the islet broke off, and plunged into the sea. The cries of the drowning animals rent the air, and the islet was reduced to the narrow strip between the site of the engulfed house and Cape Bathurst. It was now merely a piece of ice. Chapter 23. On a piece of ice. A piece of ice, a jagged triangular strip of ice, measuring 100 feet at its base, and scarcely 500 in its greatest extent. And on it 21 human beings, some 100 furred animals, a few dogs, and a large bear, which was at this moment crouching at the very edge. Yes. All the luckless colonists were there. Not one had yet been swallowed up. The last rupture had occurred when they were all in the shed. Thus far fate had spared them, probably that they might all perish together. A silent sleepless night ensued. No one spoke or moved, for the slightest shake or blow might suffice to break the ice. No one would touch the salt meat served round by Mrs. Joliffe. What would be the good of eating? Nearly every one remained in the open air, feeling that it would be better to be drowned in the open sea than in a narrow wooden shed. The next day, June 5th, the sun shone brightly down upon the heads of the doomed band of wanderers. All were still silent, and seemed anxious to avoid each other. Many gazed with troubled anxious eyes at the perfect circle of the horizon, of which the miserable little strip of ice formed the center. But the sea was absolutely deserted, not a sail, not an ice floe, not an islet. Their own piece of ice was probably the very last floating on the Bering Sea. The temperature continued to rise. The wind had gone down, and a terrible calm had set in, a gentle swell heaved the surface of the sea, and the morsel of earth and ice, which was all that was left of Victoria Island, rose and sank without change of position. Like a wreck, and what was it but a wreck? But a wreck, a piece of woodwork, a broken mast, or a few planks, remain floating. They offer some resistance to the waves, they will not melt, but this bit of ice, this solidified water, must dissolve with the heat of the sun. This piece of ice had formed the thickest part of the island, and this will explain its having lasted so long. A layer of earth and plenty of vegetation covered it, and the base of ice must have been of considerable thickness. The long bitter polar winters must have fed it with fresh ice, in the countless centuries during which it was connected with the mainland. Even now its mean height was 5 or 6 feet above the sea level, and its base was probably of about the same thickness. Although in these quiet waters it was not likely to be broken, it could not fail gradually to melt, and the rapid dissolution could actually be watched at the edges, for as the long waves licked the sides, piece after piece of ground with its verdant covering sank to rise no more. On this June 5th a fall of this nature occurred at about 1 o'clock p.m., on the site of the shed itself, which was very near the edge of the ice. There was fortunately no one in it at the time, and all that was saved was a few planks, and 2 or 3 of the timbers of the roofs. Most of the cooking utensils and all the astronomical instruments were lost. The colonists were now obliged to take refuge on the highest part of the islet, where nothing protected them from the weather, but fortunately a few tools had been left there, with the air pumps and the air vessel, which Hobson had employed for catching a little of the rain water for drinking purposes, as he no longer dared to draw for a supply upon the ice, every atom of which was of value. At about 4 o'clock p.m., the soldier Kellett, the same who had already given signs of insanity, came to Mrs. Barnett and said quietly, "I am going to drown myself, ma'am." "What, Kellett?" exclaimed the lady. "I tell you I am going to drown myself," replied the soldier. "I have thought the matter well over, there is no escape for us, and I prefer dying at once to waiting to be killed." "Kellett," said Mrs. Barnett, taking the man's hand and looking into his face, which was strangely composed, "you will not do that." "Yes, I will, ma'am, and as you have always been very good to us all, I wanted to wish you goodbye." "Goodbye, ma'am." And Kellett turned towards the sea. Mrs. Barnett, terrified at his manner, threw herself upon him and held him back. Her cries brought Hobson and Long to her assistance, and they did all in their power to dissuade the unhappy man from carrying out his purpose, but he was not to be moved, and merely shook his head. His mind was evidently disordered, and it was useless to reason with him. It was a terrible moment, as his example might lead some of his comrades to commit suicide also. At all hazards he must be prevented from doing as he threatened. "Kellett," said Mrs. Barnett gently, with a half-smile, "we have always been very good friends, have we not?" "Yes, ma'am," replied Kellett calmly. "Well, Kellett, if you like we will die together, but not today." "What, ma'am?" "No, my brave fellow, I am not ready, but tomorrow if you like." The soldier looked more fixedly than ever at the courageous woman, and seemed to hesitate an instant. Then he cast a glance of fierce longing at the sea, and passing his hand over his eyes, said, "Tomorrow." And without another word he quietly turned away and went back to his comrades. "Poor fellow," murmured Mrs. Barnett. "I have asked him to wait till tomorrow, and who can say whether we shall not all be drowned by that time." Throughout that night Hobson remained motionless upon the beach, pondering whether there might not yet be some means to check the dissolution of the islet, if it might not yet be possible to preserve it until they came in sight of land of some sort. Mrs. Barnett and Madge did not leave each other for an instant. Kaluma crouched like a dog at the feet of her mistress, and tried to keep her warm. Mrs. MacNab, wrapped in a few furs, the remains of the rich stores of Fort Hope, had fallen into a kind of torpor, with her baby clasped in her arms. The stars shone with extraordinary brilliancy, and no sounds broke the stillness of the night but the rippling of the waves and the splash of pieces of ice as they fell into the sea. The colonists, stretched upon the ground in scattered groups, were as motionless as corpses on an abandoned wreck. Sometimes Sergeant Long rose and peered into the night mists, but seeing nothing, he resumed his horizontal position. The bear, looking like a great white snowball, cowered motionless at the very edge of the strip of ice. This night also passed away without any incident to modify the situation. The grey morning dawned in the east, and the sun rose and dispersed the shadows of the night. The lieutenant's first care, as soon as it was light, was to examine the piece of ice. Its perimeter was still more reduced, and, alas, its mean height above the sea level had sensibly diminished. The waves, quiet as they were, washed over the greater part of it. The summit of the little hill alone was still beyond their reach. Long, too, saw the changes which had taken place during the night, and felt that all hope was gone. Mrs. Barnett joined Lieutenant Hobson, and said to him, "It will be today then?" "Yes, madam, and you will keep your promise to Kellett." "Lieutenant Hobson," said the lady solemnly, "have we done all in our power?" "We have, madam." "Then God's will be done." One last attempt was, however, made during the day. A strong breeze set in from the offing, that is to say, a wind bearing to the southeast, the direction in which were situated the nearest of the Aleutian Islands. How far off no one could say, as without instruments the bearings of the island could not be taken. It was not likely to have drifted far, however, unless under the influence of the current, as it gave no hold to the wind. Still it was just possible that they might be nearer land than they thought. If only a current, the direction of which it was impossible to ascertain, had taken them nearer to the much longed-for Aleutian Islands, then, as the wind was bearing down upon those very islands, it might drive the strip of ice before it if a sail of some kind could be concocted. The ice had still several hours to float, and in several hours the land might come in sight, or, if not the land, some coasting or fishing vessel. A forlorn hope truly, but it suggested an idea to the lieutenant which he resolved to carry out. Could not a sail be contrived on the islet as on an ordinary raft? There could be no difficulty in that, and when Hobson suggested it to MacNab, he exclaimed, "You are quite right, sir," adding to his men, "Bring out all the canvas there is." Every one was quite revived by this plan, slight as was the chance it afforded, and all lent a helping hand, even Kellett, who had not yet reminded Mrs. Barnett of her promise. A beam, which had once formed part of the roof of the barracks, was sunk deep into the earth and sand of which the little hill was composed, and firmly fixed with ropes arranged like shrouds and a stay. A sail made of all the clothes and coverlets still remaining fastened on to a strong pole for a yard, was hoisted on the mast. This sail, or rather collection of sails, suitably set, swelled in the breeze, and by the wake it left. It was evident that the strip of ice was rapidly moving towards the southeast. It was a success, and every one was cheered with newly awakened hope. They were no longer stationary, they were advancing slowly, it was true, but still they were advancing. The carpenter was particularly elated. All eagerly scanned the horizon, and had they been told that no land could be sighted, they would have refused to believe it. So it appeared, however. For the strip of ice floated along on the waves for 3 hours in the center of an absolutely circular and unbroken horizon. The poor colonists still hoped on. Towards 3 o'clock, the lieutenant took the sergeant aside, and said to him, "We are advancing at the cost of the solidity and duration of our islet." "What do you mean, sir?" "I mean that the ice is being rapidly fretted away as it moves along. Its speed is hastening its dissolution, and since we set sail it has diminished 1/3. "Are you quite sure?" "Absolutely certain. The ice is longer and flatter. Look, the sea lay not more than 10 feet from the hill." It was true, and the result was what might naturally have been expected from the motion of the ice. "Sergeant," resumed Hobson, "do you think we ought to take down our sail?" "I think," replied Long, after a moment's reflection, "that we should consult our comrades. We ought all to share the responsibility of a decision now." The lieutenant bent his head in assent, and the two returned to their old position on the little hill. Hobson put the case before the whole party. "The speed we have given to the ice," he said, "is causing it to wear away rapidly, and will perhaps hasten the inevitable catastrophe by a few hours. My friends, you must decide whether we shall still go on." "Forwards," cried all with one voice. So it was decided, and, as it turned out, the decision was fraught with consequences of incalculable importance. At 6 o'clock p.m. Madge rose, and pointing to a point on the southeast, cried, "Land!" Every one started up as if struck by lightning. Land there was indeed, on the southeast, 12 miles from the island. "More sail! More sail!" shouted Hobson. He was understood, and fresh materials were hastily brought. On the shrouds a sort of studding sail was rigged up of clothes, furs, everything, in short, that could give hold to the wind. The speed increased as the wind freshened, but the ice was melting everywhere. It trembled beneath the feet of the anxious watchers, and might open at any moment. But they would not think of that, they were buoyed up with hope, safety was at hand, on the land they were rapidly nearing. They shouted, they made signals, they were in a delirium of excitement. At 7:30 the ice was much nearer the land, but it was visibly melting, and sinking rapidly. Water was gushing from it, and the waves were washing over it, sweeping off the terrified quadrupeds before the eyes of the colonists. Every instant they expected the whole mass to be engulfed, and it was necessary to lighten it like a sinking vessel. Every means was tried to check the dissolution. The earth and sand were carefully spread about, especially at the edges of the ice, to protect it from the direct influence of the sunbeams, and furs were laid here and there, as being bad conductors of heat. But it was all of no avail. The lower portion of the ice began to crack, and several fissures opened in the surface. It was now but a question of moments. Night set in, and there was nothing left for the poor colonists to do to quicken the speed of the islet. Some of them tried to paddle about on planks. The coast was still 4 miles to windward. It was a dark gloomy night, without any moon, and Hobson, whose heroic courage did not even now fail him, shouted, "A signal, my friends! A signal!" A pile was made of all the remaining combustibles, 2 or 3 planks and a beam. It was set fire to, and bright flames soon shot up, but the strip of ice continued to melt and sink. Presently the little hill alone remained above water, and on it the despairing wretches, with the few animals left alive, huddled together, the bear growling fiercely. The water was still rising, and there was no sign that anyone on land had seen the signal. In less than a quarter of an hour they must all be swallowed up. Could nothing be done to make the ice last longer? In 3 hours, 3 short hours, they might reach the land, which was now but 3 miles to windward. "Oh," cried Hobson, "if only I could stop the ice from melting. I would give my life to know how. Yes, I would give my life." "There is one way," suddenly replied a voice. It was Thomas Black who spoke, the astronomer, who had not opened his lips for so long, and who had long since appeared dead to all that was going on. "Yes," he continued, "there is one way of checking the dissolution of the ice, there is one way of saving us all." All gathered eagerly round the speaker, and looked at him inquiringly. They thought they must have misheard what he said. "Well," asked Hobson, "what way do you mean?" "To the pumps," replied Black simply. Was he mad? Did he take the ice for a sinking vessel, with 10 feet of water in the hold? The air pumps were at hand, together with the air vessel, which Hobson had been using as a reservoir for drinking water, but of what use could they be? Could they harden the ice, which was melting all over? "He is mad," exclaimed Long. "To the pumps," repeated the astronomer, "fill the reservoir with air." "Do as he tells you," cried Mrs. Barnett. The pumps were attached to the reservoir, the cover of which was closed and bolted. The pumps were then at once set to work, and the air was condensed under the pressure of several atmospheres. Then Black, taking one of the leather pipes connected with the reservoir, and opening the cock, let the condensed air escape, walking round the ice wherever it was melting. Every one was astonished at the effect produced. Wherever the air was projected by the astronomer, the fissures filled up, and the surface refroze. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" shouted all with one voice. It was tiring enough to work the pumps, but there were plenty of volunteers. The edges of the ice were again solidified, as if under the influence of intense cold. "You have saved us, Mr. Black," said Lieutenant Hobson. "Nothing could be more natural," replied the astronomer quietly. "Nothing, in fact, could have been more natural." And the physical effect produced may be described as follows. There were 2 reasons for the relegation. First, under the pressure of the air, the water vaporized on the surface of the ice produced intense cold. And the compressed air in expanding abstracted the heat from the thawed surface, which immediately refroze. Wherever the ice was opening the cold cemented the edges, so that it gradually regained its original solidity. This went on for several hours, and the colonists, buoyed up by hope, toiled on with unwearying zeal. They were nearing the coast, and when they were about a quarter of a mile from it, the bear plunged into the sea, and swimming to the shore, soon disappeared. A few minutes afterwards the ice ran aground upon a beach, and the few animals still upon it hurried away in the darkness. The colonists disembarked, and falling on their knees, returned thanks to God for their miraculous deliverance. Chapter 24. Conclusion. It was on the island of Bleginie, the last of the Aleutian group, at the extreme south of Bering Sea, that all the colonists of Fort Hope at last landed, after having traversed 1,800 miles since the breaking up of the ice. They were hospitably received by some Aleutian fishermen who had hurried to their assistance, and were soon able to communicate with some English agents of the Hudson's Bay Company. After all the details we have given, it is needless to dwell on the courage and energy of the brave little band, which had proved itself worthy of its noble leader. We know how all struggled with their misfortunes, and how patiently they had submitted to the will of God. We have seen Mrs. Barnett cheering every one by her example and sympathy. And we know that neither she nor those with her yielded to despair when the peninsula on which Fort Hope had been built was converted into a wandering island, when that island became an islet, and the islet a strip of ice. Nor even when that strip of ice was melting beneath the combined influence of sun and waves. If the scheme of the company was a failure, if the new fort had perished, no one could possibly blame Hobson or his companions, who had gone through such extraordinary and unexpected trials. Of the 19 persons under the lieutenant's charge, not one was missing, and he had even 2 new members in his little colony, Kaluma and Mrs. Barnett's godson, Michael MacNab. 6 days after their rescue the shipwrecked mariners arrived at New Archangel, the capital of Russian America. Here the friends, bound together by so many dangers shared, must part, probably forever. Hobson and his men were to return to Fort Reliance across English America, whilst Mrs. Barnett, accompanied by Kaluma, who would not leave her, Madge, and Thomas Black, intended to go back to Europe via San Francisco and the United States. But whilst they were still all together, the lieutenant, addressing Mrs. Barnett, said with considerable emotion, "God bless you, madam, for all you have been to us. You have been our comforter, our consoler, the very soul of our little world. And I thank you in the name of all." 3 cheers for Mrs. Barnett greeted this speech, and each soldier begged to shake her by the hand, whilst the women embraced her affectionately. The lieutenant himself had conceived so warm an affection for the lady who had so long been his friend and counselor, that he could not bid her good-bye without great emotion. "Can it be that we shall never meet again?" he exclaimed. "No, Lieutenant," replied Mrs. Barnett, we shall meet again. If you do not come and see me in Europe, I will come back to you at Fort Reliance, or to the new factory you will found some day yet." On hearing this, Thomas Black, who had regained the use of his tongue since he had landed on terra firma, came forward and said, with an air of the greatest conviction, "Yes, we shall meet again in 36 years. My friends, I missed the eclipse of 1860, but I will not miss that which will take place under exactly similar conditions in the same latitudes in 1896. And therefore I appoint a meeting with you, Lieutenant, and with you, my dear madam, on the confines of the Arctic Ocean 36 years hence.